I am so excited to be sitting with Naftuli Moster, somebody who I only met in person recently, barring one. We crossed each other in the aisle in, I think, Grandin, Essex, a local Teaneck supermarket. But thank you so much for joining 1840 today.
Thank you for having me.
So, I know you've been talking a little bit recently about your own journey. You had a remarkable interview with Frieda Wiesel, a former guest on 1840. And I wanted to kind of start in the middle of your story because this is part of our series on Teshuva. And you've done a remarkable transformation. And I want to really try to better understand the religious context, what you've been through. And let's start in the middle. You had a storied career as an advocate for secular education in Hasidic schools. And you had some remarkable successes, setbacks, depending who you ask. But in many ways, that effort was vilified, not just within the Hasidic community, but within many parts of the observant Orthodox community.
Right.
And recently, you kind of moved away, and I just didn't hear from you for a couple of months, and then you kind of resurfaced and openly said that that's no longer a priority, that's no longer a part of what you are trying to do and charting the course. And I'm trying to better understand that change and that transformation. So let's start in the middle of the story. At what point did it first dawn upon you, did it first hit you that I don't feel aligned with this mission anymore. I don't feel aligned with what I am doing anymore?
Well, it's a good question. I think the answer is that there wasn't a single moment. It was sort of like a series of events, small and big, that sort of contributed to this overall transformation. The example I often think about is, this Dvar Torah I used to hear as a kid many times, where it's like, in Shema we say V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela ala v'avecha, right? And there's this
You should have these words on top of your heart.
On your heart. And there's this famous question, why on your heart, why not in your heart?
It's a beautiful question,
right?
Said by the Kutzker Rebbe, sure.
Okay, and the answer is that, if your heart is sort of closed, it's not letting anything in, just put it on top, one after the other, and eventually it'll all flow in. Something like that. And that's what I keep thinking about because I myself, I often struggle to sort of make sense of sort of like, was it a moment? Was it this? Was it that? And the truth is there were just, a cascade of events that sort of led me to open up. But I think there were certain sort of like important events that sort of laid the groundwork for me to be able to process things differently, see things from a different perspective. Frankly, also being a little bit sort of frustrated and disenchanted with either some of the people that I was working with or some of the things that were being done in the name of advocating for my cause. And then there were other events that sort of, made it happen, sort of pushed it over the line. Like October 7th, for instance, was a huge pivot point for me. It was like, that's when everything came flooding.
So let's pause. October 7th, let's talk October 6th. Where are you vis-a-vis the cause? You had an organization that was called YAFFED. Yeah. That was an acronym for
Young Advocates for Fair Education.
For Fair Education. And you had some remarkable victories at that point. I'm using victories. It was a cause I wouldn't say openly antagonistic to. Maybe we'll get to our one and only online interaction, but it's not one that I certainly championed. I was, right. I wasn't part of the Hasidic community, and I said, I'm definitely pro-education.
Yeah.
The way you go about change is always tricky, but you were at a good point, meaning you had a ton of attention from the media. You were involved in serious investigative pieces from the New York Times.
Right.
On October 6th, if I would have taken your temperature and said, how do you feel about this cause? Where were you the day before?
Well, I don't know if I can start at October 6th. Let's go back before that. So, going back to, I left Yafed in about September of 2022, I think. September, something like that, or maybe
almost
August.
A year before October 7th.
Exactly. More than a year. Yeah, a little bit more than a year. And you're right. Up until that point, there were a lot of, successes, setbacks. And then there was that sort of big New York Times reporting, and there was the new regulations that the state implemented, but it was really prior to that point that I began having some serious misgivings about it, and it was a big part of why I actually wanted to sort of get out of it. I already mentioned the Frieda Wiesel podcast, where I felt like some of these alignments were just, serving other people's interests, and I didn't feel like I wanted to be part of it.
It wasn't about like preserving the Hasidic community and adding education. At some point, you looked around and said, the common denominator here are people who kind of don't like the current structure or the existence of the Hasidic community.
And beyond. Meaning, and I'll get to that, there's a lot of these people, they're willing to tear down everything, really, like the family structure, right? Society in many different ways, right? And that's really what I'm getting at, that it was just unsavory. I don't want to portray them as like criminals or anything like that, but it was just like not the type of people and causes I wanted to continue to champion. Like, I'll give you some examples. I was once on a podcast interview, a panel discussion. And we had people from, different groups or whatever. And someone made this comment about how, the yeshivas, they don't teach about trans kids. And I was nodding along. I organized the panel, so I had to sort of make it go. And I was nodding. It seemed like I was doing it in agreement. And I didn't, because frankly, by that point, I was already quite turned off by that whole idea that if you support secular education, basic secular education, yeshiva, you also have to support trans and other things,
as if those were linked. Or
right, and not only that, I found that to be very harmful to the cause, because then yeshiva leaders could rightfully point to it and say, you see, they're not just after English, math, and science and social studies. They want more. They want all these different gender issues. And I was personally against all of that, but I also was like, and it's also undermining the cause, right? But anyway, there was this reporter who used to be at the New York Post, and then I think she was at Breitbart or whatever, but she cut that part of the video and was like, you see, executive director of Yafed supports teaching about trans in yeshivas. I was so frustrated about it, because little did she know, or anyone, that I actually was so opposed to that. You know what I mean? But of course, given the kinds of alliances we had, I couldn't actually come out and say, no, I'm actually opposed to that, right? And it was sort of like this epiphany. And later on, I had this, conversation with that reporter. I think we chatted on DM on Twitter, and I discovered that she's lesbian. She's married to another woman. And I was like, wow, why do you not like this? And she was like, it was amazing what came out of it, that she was like, yeah, I know I'm gay and lesbian and not accepted in that world, but that's okay. I have no expectation that they would accept my kid in their school, and that's okay. And it was like an interesting kind of like realization.
Shift. It doesn't align.
Yeah, it was a realization that someone can feel very different, can be different, but still respect that here you have a community that wants to retain their values and to respect that. There was another one around that time when the state came out with their new regulations, which we were sort of happy with, but also disappointed with. And one of the reasons we were disappointed is because it provided multiple pathways, they call it, of how to prove substantial equivalency, how to prove that a yeshiva is complying with the law. We always used to talk about the government coming in and inspecting, right? That kind of thing, but the government basically laid out multiple pathways, including one which seemed to be like, everyone's going to exploit this. It's about taking assessments, giving exams to the kids and seeing how they perform. And we're like, you know how it goes.
They'll fill out you have teachers filling out the bubbles. I mean, we've had scandals like that outside in the regular world.
Exactly.
The teachers are going to be incentivized to make sure that they pass it. Okay.
But what bothered me the most of it was that when yeshiva leaders, I think they correctly sort of called the bluff of the government and frankly us and everyone by saying that we're confident that with a little amount of secular education we teach, or even perhaps without teaching secular education, you're right, there might be some cheating, but I think there was also an argument that even without that, our kids will still do as well, if not better, than the local public school kids whose performance rate was like at 23% or something like that, right? And it was just, to me, it was so sort of eye-opening. I mean, I've worked in public schools. I've kind of seen how things were. But it was also eye-opening that it was like, we have a real problem here that, again, my allies, they're allies in terms of trying to advocate for secular education, but their entire mahus, their entire sort of
character and way about it
undermines everything else, because they're the ones pushing to dilute what it means to be educated, what it means to educate kids in the public schools, and thereby undermines us, because now the yeshivas can easily say, sure, we're comparable to public schools, just look at our grades. So there were a lot of these sort of little things that were happening that sort of led me to feel very uncomfortable with, who we were aligned. And
on a personal level during this period, the effect that the advocacy and you were, and I was going to say, I don't know, rightfully so, wrongfully so, we could talk about how you feel towards it. But the community mobilized very strongly, not just against the cause, but against you personally.
Right.
Seeing that you were the one, because you were the most successful, you're going to find
I was the face of it.
You were the face of the movement.
Yeah.
What effect on a personal level did this have with your religious life? We're still talking pre-October 7th.
Yes.
Where are you religiously during this period?
Well, from about, I would say like 2013 or maybe even, probably prior to that, till maybe 2022, we were not living in the religious community. We were Jewish. We would participate in Jewish sort of conservative synagogues, perhaps, but not any strong ties outside of my work, of course, right? So
I'm curious, during that period, you managed, and sometimes people need that period like away from it. Did you find yourself when you would go, you would go to a non-Orthodox synagogue? You obviously you grew up in a Hasidic community. Were there things that you remember that you loved about it and found it refreshing? And were there things during that period that you still found yourself longing for the community you came from?
I mean, almost everything was in some sense like longing for the type of community I came from. I was always a big vocal sort of supporter or whatever, advocate for more community. Do you know I once actually started what I then called an OTD minyan?
Oh, really?
I swear. An OTD minyan. We found this shul in Midtown Manhattan that was barely used, and they were going to let us use
OTD for our listeners is an acronym that's used off the derech, people who grew up within the Orthodox community and then left, a term that is used, but we don't love the term, but it's off the derech, people who go. So you created a minyan.
I created a minyan. So basically, we were going to have this shul. And the idea was that we were going to meet weekly during Shacharis Shabbos time over there, and there would be some type of program, the singing part of the davening. For Kriyas Torah, we could either have Kriyas Torah or there would be some other type of presentation, and then there would be a Kiddush. Maybe even coffee before davening. This was going to be the plan.
I kind of love it, I'll be honest with you.
I love it too, and I would love to get back to it, but from a slightly different perspective. But because I felt that the current organizations or organization, singular, I don't know, that support people who've left the community neglected that very, very important component of community. I would often ask, what is the most common denominator that affects all people who leave? And it was community. Instead, they would provide one-on-one support, small group support, and eventually I felt pivoted to become a little bit too far left and catering to those who were on the sort of the whole gender spectrum thing. But what was missing was real community, consistency. What's something about the Jewish world that it's so, the Haredi world, it's so consistent, right?
It's every Shabbos.
For many people, it's 3 times a day. But at a minimum, it's every single Shabbos, rain, sun, snow. I vividly remember as a kid, my father, it was 4 feet of snow, whatever. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but easily a foot of snow or more. We'd walk in the snow, in the street, because nobody was driving, to shul. And if we were the first one, we knew the code, unlocked it, walked in, and eventually the shul filled up. Again, even if it was a big snowstorm,
Something very lovely about that. Not even.
But the consistency is what's so important, not having a one-off event here, a one-off event there. So I was a big fan of community.
Can I say a word about that? Just
Sure.
because it's something I've seen, and it's something I've seen that really, I've seen it fosters best within the Orthodox community, and it's the idea of commitment even when it's inconvenient. Meaning every time, there are always movements both in the secular world and in the non-Orthodox world, like digital detox, and they realize the beauty and importance of Shabbos, but I feel like there's a sense of I want Shabbos when it's convenient, and there's something I know about growing up with that very fixed, oftentimes suffocating observance that is fostered in the Orthodox community.
Yeah.
That it's a type of observance that it's there for you even when it's inconvenient.
Right.
It's specifically Shabbos is never convenient.
Right.
It's a headache every Friday. But when it's there, even when it's inconvenient, it's reliable. It's tangible.
Yes.
So did you attempt to find community in those years? Those wandering years.
Of course, yes. By the way, about that minyan, it only lasted one Shabbos. It was very successful, but and we had a nice kiddush, and someone came over at the kiddush and said he's sponsoring the next 10 keddashim. That's plural for kiddush, not kiddushes, as we say here.
Yeah.
But then the rabbi and the director of the shul, they saw how successful it was, and they're like, okay, initially it was going to be, they were going to let us use it for free, and then they're like, starting next week you have to pay rent, and
Gotcha.
I was like, we're just getting started, I can't afford it, and I was in grad school, so and I was running Yafed in my spare time, so I kind of gave it up. But
I hope you come back to that. The world needs
that. Right?
The world needs a minyan for people who davening is hard for.
100%. And I do regret that I let it go. And anyone who listens to this, if they want to pick it up and run with it, by all means, I think that would be great.
Got to work on the name. Got to figure out the OTD.
Even then, we were playing with it, and we were thinking at some point we were like, it's not called OTD Minyan, it's just called the Minyan. Yeah, we had some different ideas.
It's a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
But tell me about your search. So you're in those years.
Yes.
There are a lot of communities and Jewish communities in the New York, New Jersey area. Your attempts, did you join a non-Orthodox synagogue?
Not modern Orthodox, because I wasn't Orthodox.
But did you join a non-Orthodox?
I thought you said modern Orthodox. Yes, we went to conservative shuls in Rockland, especially when we had kids, and they had a little program here and there, and that was a big part of it, because for the kids, it's such an isolating experience when they don't have any friends, So we tried a few of them, and it was lacking excitement. It was every shul you go to, you see that it was already downsized, and it was already merged, and it's still declining, and it's like there's not a lot of hope here for a growing future. What does the trajectory say? It was very concerning for us, and then there were other things that we were missing from childhood. And, there was an attempt to try to sort of fit it in within our existing lifestyle, but it wasn't easy, so that's how we lived for a while.
So bring me to October 7th. October 7th is this world shattering, but specifically for the Jewish community. Right. And it's interesting because pre-October 7th, I assume you weren't a major Zionist. You didn't grow up in a Zionist community.
No, to the contrary. That's the whole point. I guess I was sort of pro-Israel, if there was such thing in my, growing up. But in the years leading up to it, the decade or so prior to it, I was enmeshed with groups on the left of the side of the spectrum. My supporters and funders and friends were J Street, if not Jewish Voice for Peace and people like that. So to me, prior to October 7th, that's where I was really aligned with. I had still bought in, even though by this point I had already left Yafed, and I no longer had this very close alliance with these people. I didn't interact with them on a regular basis, but my mindset was still bought into the whole oppressor versus oppressed kind of mentality. And, I despised institutions, especially like the sort of parochial or whatever, like the big, powerful Jewish groups like AIPAC. I considered them,
The enemy.
yeah, not necessarily the enemy, but yeah, like too powerful and disproportionately powerful, and upholding the hawkish,
The old ways.
yeah,
and-
exactly. And I was on a crusade to sort of tear down the mainstream Jewish institutions. A lot of it stemmed from the fact that I felt that major mainstream Jewish organizations were either supporting or not calling out the Haredi leadership for their, for fighting against secular education. So again, it was all sort of like black and white. These are the bad guys, these are the good guys. So this was prior to October 7. I was very much, critical of Israel, and I was seen with those people. But then October 7 happened, and I'll tell you, the truth is, initially, I still had this sort of instinct to almost be like, they had it coming, which is, again, a lot of people who don't like Israel
That was
feel,
their message.
and many of them still do. And I think that to me was like a big eye-opening moment when, in the days and weeks after October 7, here I was obsessively watching the horrors from the Hamas GoPro cameras and seeing the just sheer brutality of it. And I look on social media and I see my former friends and allies justifying it, some celebrating it.
I'm not asking for specific names, but do you remember specific people who
I
you
do.
were?
Of course, I do. I do remember some, yeah. Some are, high profile. Some are OTD leaders, if you will, who've sort of, transcended from being in the OTD world to joining the just mainstream far left Jewish world. But it was just, so I see that, and I was already living in an Orthodox environment, and I saw the pain in the eyes of the Jewish people, and it was such a horrible time. Something was off about that whole period, and what I was, the image, the visuals here. I couldn't stand it. And I kept investigating in my head, and me and my wife, we used to constantly talk about this, trying to sort of hash out, what is it that these people, the protesters, are seeing or not seeing that's making them be critical of Israel during such a time? And it was just, I sort of came up with this list, and there were times where I was going to write op-eds about this. I was in a difficult place because I still had that identity as the critic and supporting the underdog, and aligning with the oppressed. So it was a very unique situation, and I was still running Shtetl, which in some sense was also sort of continuing the tradition I had of criticizing the Haredi leadership and the systems. So I was in a unique position where my mind was actually changing a lot, but physically, daily, I was still doing some of the same work. But I came up with this sort of list of like things, that characteristics of the people who are sort of very critical of Israel. One was that they're almost all young, very young, right? You see the college campus protesters. Number two, that they're mostly childless. And number three is that they're mostly communityless. They have no community. And when those three things combine, even when one of them happens, I find that the person is more likely to sort of have less at stake, have less appreciation for communities, for families.
Especially societies whose very goal is to kind of uphold and center traditional family life, which is kind of at the heart of Judaism, or what Judaism represents.
Yes.
I think you're saying something very profound. I'm like hesitant to I don't want to make an argument here, but I've noticed the same thing. It's always very strange to me, the common denominator between gender ideology and anti-Zionism. It was a baffling pairing to me.
It all comes back to the same thing. I'll get to it. Because when you have that combination, first of all, you're young, your prefrontal cortex or whatever, the executive function hasn't fully developed, right? This is science, okay? There's a reason why car insurance companies, have a higher rate for people who are under 25, right? When you don't have children, that instinct to protect your kids and in some way yourself for your kids hasn't yet kicked in the same level. And childless people who listen to this will be like, how dare he? Of course I know. No, you don't. No, you don't. Until you actually have kids, you have not experienced the need to protect another human being and to protect yourself so that your kids are not fatherless or motherless, right? So that's a very important one. And then the third one is also like when you don't have community, you seek it elsewhere. A lot of these college kids, either they never had community growing up or they're away from home, right? And they currently have no sense of belonging, no connection to people. In swoops, SJP, what's it called?
Student Justice for
Yes,
Peace. Student Justice
for Palestine. They swoop in and they sort of exploit these impressionable young people.
Did you know people who worked there?
I think there were some people who overlap, but not particularly SJP. But what happens then is you have, for Jewish students, sometimes there's a little bit of a barrier because they do come from families that value family life and that value community. And that's when Jewish groups swoop in, whether it's, Jewish Voice for Peace or similar kind of groups. And they sort of kosher this sort of criticism of Israel, and they provide a whole community around it, right? They now have, like the whole Seder, the Seder, the
anti-Zionist Seder.
Yeah, that's like sort of like was to me actually helped me make so much sense of it, because that's at the core. They provide these young, lonely individuals with a strong sense of community, or even not a strong sense of community, but one that they currently don't have on their college campus.
I want to return to kind of that post-October 7th, that disappointment. And I felt that too. We were in different stations, but we both had and have, I think, very real ties with people to the left of us. You were deep, much deeper than myself. And there really was a deep sense of betrayal, disappointment, and frustration. I'm curious why you think you never got fully swept away, meaning a lot of people get fully swept away with that. I guess you were married with children. You kind of had a little bit of a
grounding, yeah,
of a grounding. Did October 7th, meaning you changed the way you looked at your allies? I'm curious how, if at all, you changed the way you looked at your former adversaries, meaning the Hasidic community and the Orthodox community.
Oh, 100%. 100%. When I came to the realization that, let's stick to Israel for a minute. You have these millions and millions of young, impressionable kids, again, without children, without community, who've sort of bought into this narrative, oppressed versus oppressor.
A narrative that you yourself had bought into
yes.
at a point.
When they're all urging the government, the U.S. government, to withhold weapons from Israel, withhold funding, sanction Israel, isolate Israel, if it weren't for our strong institutions like AIPAC, which I used to despise, Israel would be kaput. I mean it. I honestly, I don't think a lot of people realize how much groups like AIPAC stand in the way, because the numbers are just not in our favor. We're small people.
Yeah.
Israel is a small country surrounded by, many, unfriendly countries with many, many millions more people. And in the United States itself, we're still a small number. If it weren't for these institutions that are well organized, well funded, and supported by the Jewish community, or put it this way, if people like me were successful in undermining them, Israel would be in actual deep trouble, which makes sense why people try to tear down groups like AIPAC. it just wouldn't stand a chance, right? It's sort of like the thing that counters the millions of young, impressionable voices that would love to just destroy Israel. That epiphany, like, really helped me also make sense of the Haredi systems and institutions. I used to, when I would meet funders of J Street funders, who would also be Yafed funders, I would actually use their language. So I would say, you have AIPAC, I have Agudath Israel, right? AIPAC is to your J Street what Agudath Israel is to my Yafed, right? Basically that this is the oppressor, this is the group that has disproportionate power, we have to fight them, we have to, undermine them, we have to build.
Because if we take away this barrier, then
Yes.
the whole thing comes crashing down.
Yes. And to be clear, the whole thing crashing down, I was never sort of calling for the yeshivas to crash down, but like the barrier would crash down and we would be able to push for secular education more easily. And suddenly I had this new appreciation for Jewish institutions. And I can recognize that some of these institutions do bad stuff or don't do enough good, or, like they try to do something and they're not
in Jewish
successful.
institutions. So anybody who's anytime you stepped into the kitchen, so to speak, and see how the sausage is made, I don't think there's a person in the world who's ever worked for a Jewish organization who emerged and said, "Oh, it's perfect." Well,
By the way, and that's another funny dynamic
that's a product of being an institution.
Okay, but interestingly, amongst sort of people on the left, especially in the far left, there's this notion, they put these institutions on this pedestal and they're like, you made this mistake, you're done, you shouldn't exist, you should be destroyed. And they often don't look at themselves as, it's sort of like how sort of media outlets would often call out other media outlets. Oh, the mainstream media does this, but we, they could be equally biased in a different direction. They can have their own flaws. And I found that some of these liberal groups, they're often the underdog, but they could be super, super flawed in all kinds of different ways. And every so often a scandal comes out, about their organizations too, but there's this sense of like, yeah, fine, but we're not established, we're the underdog, we're allowed to make mistakes. But the truth is, very well run machines, very well run organizations can make mistakes, but that's not even the point here. I've come to appreciate the fact that these organizations, I have like this weird admiration for them, that they put up such a fight against, ironically, me. They put up a fight to defend their way of life against or from people who don't have an appreciation for it, who don't have an appreciation for, family, structure, for community, all the things that bring an insane amount of joy and, fulfillment to hundreds of thousands of people. So, yeah, that was actually a big
like it was
epiphany.
a turning, like you.
Yeah. I began to appreciate it, and there's a lot more that I also realized that, how do I say it? Amongst the sort of the far left, I don't know if I'll be able to articulate this well, but I've sort of discovered, the humanity in people around this time. And by that, I know it's like a bit of a buzzword. People use, finding people's humanity. It's supposed to be a positive. To me, it's the opposite. I've discovered that we're just humans. Like in the most simple term, we're all just humans with flaws. And that's really what we're humans. We're just like one step above animals, right? In my previous interview, I actually got flack for this, for using this, saying that we're just animals. But that's what it is. I've discovered we're just humans, and we're just we have the ability to talk and to build things.
But there's no sanctuary where it's just the malachim, just angels.
And that's the thing, but we're still humans. What are some of the key characteristics of humans? And again, and animals. There's basic, instincts like lust, fear, the need to procreate, the need to protect your cubs, your children, and your people, your community, your herd, whatever. And I find that in the woke world, they sort of try to deny all of that. So in some sense, they deny people's humanity. they deny this. So I'll give you an example. Like, it's become, optional to whether, like procreation is such a basic
Having children has become
function
a real
of humanity.
cultural debate.
Yes.
On the like pronatalism, antinatalism.
Yes.
Should you have children? Should you not have children?
And it's like
Coming from especially the Orthodox, from the frum world, I suffer from the same thing. It's strange to me to watch humanity debate this.
Right.
Because it's the most, in my opinion, and I know there's a lot of broken families out there, there are a lot of people who it doesn't work out, but the most tried and true vehicle for happiness is having a healthy relationship.
But I mean, even more.
Children.
Even more on a very basic level. For people who believe in science and evolution, this is the very first thing, that we only got to where we are, and we will only get anywhere by procreating. You can experiment with all kinds of different things, but ultimately this is it. And so it's like on many of these things where I found that the far left is sort of trying to deny these very basic things, and it's just not what it is. And I think like that was big. That was part of it. I guess maybe that's the through line of it all, where I was like, we're humans. And so like I look at the community I once sort of challenged and criticized, and I'm like, they're humans, and they have this very tight community that serves them well, and they want to protect it. So coming after them, even for something as simple as bringing in new education, if it's not done in a very, very careful and sensitive way, I don't blame them for circling the wagons.
I want to hear a little bit about how you were able, if at all, it wasn't just a cause, meaning you had a lot of very real pain and experiences growing up in the community. You did not have a good educational experience. If my memory serves me correctly, you were subject of abuse when you were growing up. And correct me if I'm wrong.
Not, I wouldn't,
No?
I wasn't a victim or a survivor of sex abuse in that way. So I wouldn't say that. I didn't have the best childhood. That is true. But
but my question is not even litigating whether it was good or bad, but at some point, aside from the cause that you dropped, it feels like in a way you were able to let go of a lot of your own resentment. Like you softened.
Yes.
And I'm curious, how did you soften? I'll just cut to it. I remember the one time we interacted online. I don't know if you remember. I think maybe the first time we got together in person. I may have brought it up. It was after one of these. It was like the height of the Hasidic education debate. And I shared an article that was opposed to it, and people got very upset. Right. How could you even share an article? That means you agree with the article. You know what you do. And I remember we didn't follow one another. We never interacted. And I remember you said, and this might be that I've been monitoring you, like a very like parochial. And like I probably made a joke about it, but I saw somebody who's clearly been very hurt and who is not trusting and is probably has like a very negative, instinctive reaction to the community. So I understand why you distanced yourself from, your supposed allies on the left and people who are trying to tear down yeshivas. How were you able to heal, to let go of some of that adversarialness to your own community? Did you at any point, was there anybody who you reached out to say, I'm sorry? Was there...
So first of all, yes, I was sort of monitoring in the sense that, it was all about trying to sort of gain allies and gauge where people stand on it and pushing back hard. Oftentimes, to me, my paranoia, which is not unwarranted, was that perhaps behind the scenes, people like you who are polished and well-spoken and well-educated and don't even live in the Haredi community are propping up the Haredi system, whether it's in the halls of government or elsewhere. Sure. And I believe that to some degree it does happen, but what I began to realize is that actually I was like, wow, people like you actually understood it before I did. Like, I remember there were these people, whether it was in social media or in person, not a lot, but some people would just push back right to my face about this whole issue of secular education, the Haredi yeshivas. Like, let them live their lives and all that stuff. And I thought it was so bizarre. But I was like, in hindsight, I'm able to realize that they saw something that I didn't see. They understood everything I just described. They understood that already. I'll give you a specific person. You know Congressman Richie Torres?
Sure.
He used to be a city council member, and he was the chair of the oversight committee. Next to him was a guy, I just forgot his name, but he was the chair of the education department, and he's now the CEO of the JCRC.
Okay.
Forgot his name at the moment. Initially, when there was a report that came out that found that Mayor de Blasio interfered with the investigation, this is a mayor ago, they told the New York Post, which I'm sure they sort of, extracted from them, that they want to launch an investigation into it. And I never found them to be particularly strong allies, but I thought, okay, this is a pivoting moment. And then they changed, and they just sort of dropped the whole thing. And
I remember this controversy online.
And then Richie Torres would then go and meet with the yeshiva leaders and in general, the community leaders. And I was like, what a sellout, what a sellout. But you know what else happened during that time? There were the Muncie stabbing attack, the Jersey City shooting, and frankly, every other day in Brooklyn, whether it's Borough Park, Williamsburg, or Crown Heights, a Hasidic man or a Hasidic kid was smacked
by a group of hooligans, teenagers.
The hat, tossed off. And I think they recognized it sort of like the same way I had an awakening when October 7 happened, sort of me vis-a-vis the Jewish world in general and vis-a-vis Israel. I think he and many other people saw that with regards to the Haredi world. And I was screaming from the rooftops, anti-Semitism has nothing to do with secular education. You can sort of fight anti-Semitism, but still appreciate, still fight for secular education. But I can also see why not. Like, I can see this idea of like, no, this is a community that's under attack.
Constantly. It's
under attack and physically, and this comes across like potentially an attack to the character of their community. I don't want anything to do with it, or I'll push back against it. So in hindsight, I'm able to sort of see all of that. And whether this was consciously going through your mind or not at the time, now I'm appreciating that people like you would at least be like, yeah, if it were me, I would improve the secular education yeshivas, but I'm not fond of the whole approach. I'm not. That
was basically my
right. I'm not going to go and fight them because I also like what they stand for. To me, it was all like, what do you mean? If they're not providing a secular education, like that trumps everything.
Yeah,
it's neglect. Nothing else matters. I'll give you an example. You're affiliated with the Orthodox Union.
Yeah.
That was another group where I was so frustrated by their sort of. I was like, yes. I was like, your schools do teach the basic secular education.
So you should know better than anyone.
Yeah, and you should fight for it, and you should definitely not oppose us. And there were a few instances where they were like opposed to certain regulations and stuff. It was so frustrating to me. But in hindsight, I understand that to them, yes, they could agree that it's a problem, but they also appreciated that the community institutions and leaders need to be strong. They need to be able to fight off these things because otherwise there are other threats down the line.
And the whole thing can collapse.
The whole thing can collapse. It sounds weird that I sound like a hawk right now. I believe it very strongly. I believe, that there have to be guards,
I remember for me, because I'm thinking about this idea of like the way we are able to radicalize ourselves, and like sometimes we could be the subject of it, sometimes we can be the object. And when I shared this, I shared an article and said, I think it raises interesting points. Like not a very strong. I'm not a strong. That's just not how I share generally. Uh-huh. And I remember it caused a huge storm online. And one person who I've since have a very nice, warm relationship with, But I remember she said online in exasperation, she's like, "Are you telling me the I read this over Shabbos guy is anti-education?" And I was like, "What? Like, whoa! Like, I got painted into a very narrow corner."
Right.
Meaning that, like, I shared an article
Right.
that was, clearly on the other side. I didn't write it.
Right.
I shared it. And that immediately painted me, I'm anti-education,
Right.
to the point where, like, how could the guy who's...
I think the argument was that no one has ever seen you share
From the other side.
an article from the other side, sort of sounding
Yeah.
positive or favorable. But again, at this point, it's all water under the bridge as far as I'm concerned, because I actually appreciate it. That's what I'm saying. I can see now that a guy like you who lives in the system and appreciates the need for institutions and the need for sort of fences to protect this very, very important community, whether it's yours or the Haredi community or both in some sense, right? The Orthodox Jewish world. I get it now. That's the point. I get it. I don't even...
I would say it's even more. It's more than water under the bridge. Like, the reason why we never interacted after that until we bumped into each other in the supermarket, and I wasn't sure. I recognized you. It took a second, and you introduced yourself, and I wasn't sure
if I wanted to punch you.
No, yeah, exactly. I didn't know. So I was just
I was already, long moved on, by that point.
So I'm curious. You must have people who are younger now.
You did ask me earlier if there were, like, I don't remember the context, but you asked if there were other people who reached out.
I want to know if you had formally asked anybody from Mechila for saying, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to you that the answer at the moment, we're recording it now, probably a few weeks before it airs. The answer is, I don't think so. No. But can
we sit on that for 1 second?
Sure.
Do you feel like you owe the community an apology?
Wow, that's a good question. Because I'm not interested in prolonging this whole sort of debate, and I'm not looking to sort of play the blame game, I do think I owe people an apology. And I think it wasn't handled well. I think it wasn't handled well because I've always been sort of open to doing things differently, and I was looking for an off-ramp. I think it was a big mistake that, Agudath Israel couldn't, just reach out. And I made multiple attempts to reach out to them, to reach out even to Pearls, to basically dispel this whole point that I'm trying to tear down. I would often say this also publicly, like, if only they really implement a serious system of English, math, science, and social studies, there would be no YAFFED. It would shut down. Okay, we have no interest in doing more than that. So, again, I understand both of their thinking. Like, on the one hand, they have to protect their community. We can't have some, person over there, trying to tear it down, trying to force change on their community. But I think strategically thinking, there were mistakes there as well, because just from a strategic perspective, like, engage the person, try to walk them off the tree or whatever, off the ladder.
My approach to this has always been based on the comments of Tosfos in Pesachim on 113b, I believe, Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, where Tosfos is commenting on a passage of Talmud in, I believe, Bav Metzia, which talks about that there are people who you are allowed to hate, you're supposed to hate. And the Gemara still says that such people, they should have precedence for who you should help when someone's trying to, like, unload their groceries, unload their donkey. They get precedence. And Tosfos wants to know, why should they get precedence? You're allowed to hate them. You're supposed to hate them. And Tosfos says, because the hatred that you show to them is going to escalate it. And then they're going to hate you back even more until it's going to lead to a sinna gemura, an absolute hatred. And that we never have that. We never allow that. We're never going for that. And what I find very often, and I look at it, I don't necessarily look at either party as to blame, but it's like a cycle of escalation where you feel targeted, they feel targeted, so then we're going to target back and you target back. And then before you know it, it's this Sina Gemura. It's like there's this comment that made a real impact on me that Shalom Karmi once made, if you'll allow me to share it, because I think you're really a paradigm of this in many ways and experienced it firsthand in both directions, to be clear. Like you towards the Orthodox world and the Orthodox advocacy world towards you, it just led to this escalation. And I think a lot about this comment that Shalom Karmi wrote an article in tribute to the rabbi of my shul growing up, who was Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, an incredible philosopher, an ethicist, a really noble, exalted person. And Rabbi Wurzburger, paraphrased by Rabbi Karmi, was discussing, I know this is a crazy segue, was discussing the comment of the Ramban, Nachmanides, who says that even though the Egyptians were instructed to enslave and persecute the Jewish people, God still punished them, even though they were acting as God's messengers. Why did they punish them? Because, and this is the paraphrase of Rabbi Wurzburger from Rabbi Karmi explaining this Ramban, even a just war has the power to corrupt those who wage it. Meaning, it's too hard when you have a cause, and it could be a just cause and a rightful cause, but sometimes when you wage that war, it has this like corrupting effect on us and the way that we look at the world. And I remember that period where like it felt like every interaction there was a line in the sand on where do you stand on this issue. And I was always like, look, there's a reason why I don't live in the Hasidic community and don't send my kids there. Like, you know, I raise my kids the way I want to raise them, and overall, I don't really trust the government to get involved in these matters. And probably the difference between you and I, even back then, was much thinner. But you know, it's the power of I think in a just war, the more justified you are, I think the greater the capacity to corrupt. The same way, you know, like even the people who came after you, I get it. But it can lead to that absolute hatred.
I think it's so interesting what you're saying, because first of all, it sort of corroborates the point I was making before, and I made on the previous interview about how it forces you to get into bed with some of the wrong people, but also on a personal level, you know, it raises your blood pressure, your heart rate, and it puts you into like a more, you know, non-peaceful place, you know. So it's how you interact with your own family, with friends, you know, you're not the same. So it does have that kind of terrible effect on people. I fully agree. I did not like how that period made me sort of feel and be in general, you know. And I'm sure you know, like I would basically argue that everything is related, right? Talk about intersectionality, but I would say, look, the lack of education results in people not being able to earn a living, and those who do, must be because of fraud, and therefore I sort of felt it was my mission to expose fraud in the Haredi community. It's a very bad place to be, and that was a big part of what I wanted to move away, you know, more recently. Again, it gets back to this idea of like, these are human beings, you know, people who have families, people who have kids. You really, really need to think long and hard before you call someone out publicly or before you sort of unleash the authorities on them. I saw this when I was working in journalism, where there were people who were like, if there was like a slight allegation against someone, you know, even something dating back 20 years where the victim or the alleged, you know, victim may not even fully remember what actually happened, may have false memories, which is a real topic, a real thing. And they were just like, yeah, go blast the the abuser, who's really an alleged abuser, publicly without any due process. It's just sort of like it has to be assumed that it's true, it's fact. Again, this is the kind of thing you find more among the far left.
Can I bring you back to? I want to think about this moment and specifically go in two directions. I speak to a lot of people who, over whether it was with the finding the right education system, or for a lot of people, depending on their leanings and style, it was during COVID, and they felt that the Hasidic community or the yeshiva community they were a part of, they were too lax with the regulations, and there was a period, between 2017 and 2022 when a lot of people kind of lost their faith in Jewish community from within the Hasidic world, from within the yeshiva world. We call it, the language we use as being hashkafically homeless. We have it even, I had a right over there on the wall, you could see where my office, it says, there's 1840 projects, it's hashkafically homeless shelter.
Interesting.
People who felt that they were bereft of community.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what advice you would give to other people who are probably where you were. Maybe they don't have a cause.
Right.
They're not in the New York Times.
Right.
But they feel lost. They don't feel that community from the establishment in the Hasidic world and the yeshiva world. And they have change, and I understand that.
Right.
And they're looking for community, and they're looking for home, and they find themselves, I don't know, maybe they're in Park Slopes or wherever they find themselves.
Right.
What advice would you give them on how to build a healthy life? They're like, there's a whole category of people, you probably know a lot of them. They're in between. They're not quite disassociated from the community, because if you're really disassociated, we wouldn't hear from you.
Right.
But you're not in it, and you're lost. What advice would you give to someone who finds himself in that place?
I didn't think I was going to come here and give advice, but if they could learn something from my own experience, like I now have such a appreciation for. I used to be authority figures, institutions. I had zero belief in them, and I thought they were all corrupt, all self-interested, and it's probably true to a certain degree, but they all play such an important role in upholding the community that we all find dear. And I will say, about 2 decades ago, this would have been a different conversation. It wasn't easy to be, it was much more black and white in the Haredi world, right? It wasn't easy to be what many people are now. They're relaxed, they're chilled, whether they live in, Pomona or sort of on the outskirts of Borough Park. They can have their own shuls and,
like the Minyan. They have their own kind of.
Right. And the sacrifice to remain part of the community has become so little, right? The buy-in,
cost of the exit, because you don't have to go that far.
You don't have to leave. But I think a lot of people, as they're contemplating leaving the community, they feel suffocated, as you described before. They don't understand that this is probably the best time of your life, right? I mean, you got to find, a way to be comfortable. If someone has a spouse who's just like a strong fanatic, but this spouse has chilled down, there's a bit of a mismatch. Take your time, take it easy, try to work it through and find a good, happy place for you, but within the community. I do not see a reason for anyone to leave the community. It sounds crazy. It sounds crazy to say, but I think, by nature, we're meant to stay where you are. It's unnatural. Imagine two herds of animals where someone just picks themselves up and leaves. It doesn't happen. It's the most unnatural thing for us to leave our home base, to leave our communities. And what I mean by that is that it's going to cause so much disorientation in your life for the rest of your life.
And you went through.
Well, I did, and many people are going through this, and I at least have been able to find a good, happy place and integrate. It's still not easy, right? Because I still feel like forever it'll feel like we were ripped away a little bit. And I don't think people understand. Again, it goes back to this humanity, these basic instincts that nowadays we try to deny. We try to think we could just pick ourselves up and find a new community, find a new place. I can't even understand people who move to a different country or even for good reasons,
I'm
for
just talking
marriages,
about this with a dear friend today, how he somebody who is a major figure in mental health, and was saying himself how much changing he made Aliyah and moved to Israel, and how much that move has been tough on his mental health, because so much of our self is buried and intertwined with our community, which is why when they disappoint you, it's so painful.
It's so deep. People don't understand how much our brains process when we are kids and grown-ups, but like basically throughout our entire lives. It sort of stores all these familiar things, and suddenly you rip yourself up and you go to a different place. Again, this means in everything, growing up, we're talking about the type of food we eat, the type of language we speak, the music we listen to, the people we're surrounded by, imagery, how it gets stored in our brain, and suddenly to change the imagery, people moving to a place where people speak in a different accent. I can only imagine
it's jarring.
Mentally, again, evolutionarily speaking, we're just not meant for it. So anyone who's thinking of, sort of throwing it all away because it's difficult or it's suffocating or whatever, it's not as suffocating as it's going to be on the outside for most people. For most people.
Correct.
So I would say really exhaust every single avenue to try to make your life in the community, whichever community this is, by the way, to make it as comfortable as possible, and then stay. And this also means staying with your family, staying in your marriages, just stay.
So I want to ask two other questions about that, and I appreciate the sentiment, because I do think that if it's possible, and for some people it is impossible, but for those that it's possible, the yield of happiness, even with the discomfort, is going to be much better than, ripping yourself off from that foundational identity and, like pretending like you're starting with a blank slate, which we never really do.
Right.
But one thing I wanted to ask you about is that, anytime I speak to somebody, it's like a cliche in the modern Orthodox community when you hear people struggling within the Hasidic world. It's like, you should become modern Orthodox. And I understand why that's not always a great suggestion, because I think though I live within the modern Orthodox community, I'm exposed to, a bit more than what we have here. I want to hear a little bit about you. You grew up, your childhood was in very much the Hasidic world, and now you are living in the borough park of modern Orthodoxy, which is Teaneck. So I'm curious, learning how to find nourishment, meaning it's not the same. I don't hear from you that you feel like you're in a conservative shul in Muncie or whatever. You feel like you have a home, you feel like you have community, but it's within the modern Orthodox world.
Right.
How were you able to find that nourishment from within the modern Orthodox world? And what notes would you give, not in a vicious, critical way, but what notes would you give? What do you still long for even after you've established roots here that maybe the modern Orthodox world could improve upon?
Maybe the yapchik at the Kiddush?
The yapchik, we don't make it.
No. How do I say it? So first of all, I will say, if someone absolutely cannot possibly stay in the Haredi world, I think modern Orthodoxy should be considered. It should. In the past, I didn't. I sort of laughed it off. If you're not believing, if you're not religious, then just go all the way.
Yeah.
But again, that failed to take this very basic evolutionary need to belonging. And if you can't belong here, then stay as close as possible as you can. Mm-hmm. You're going to hear familiar words, even if it's something as simple as Shabbat Shalom, if it's not Good Shabbos. Some people will say Good Shabbos too, so that's good too, right? But
I'm on team Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. But it's like, just again, evolutionary, the way our brains have been wired for so many years, for decades in the community, it's going to give you a level of comfort. So I do believe that if someone absolutely must leave the Haredi community, do become modern Orthodox. Now,
tell me about your adjustments to the modern Orthodox world. Were there specific things you were like, I don't know what's happening here, or this is not how I remember it?
well, so there were a few things. First of all, yes, just even if I came straight from the Haredi community to the modern Orthodox community, something as simple as the Nusach would be very confusing to me. Growing up, we daven Nusach Ashkenaz and the Hasidic way. So happens to be my shul has an Ashkenaz minyan. So I'm sorry. Let me take this back. Growing up, we daven Nusach Sfard.
Yes.
And a Hasidic, Nusach and such. Happens to be my shul where I go does have a Sephardi minyan, but it's like real Sephardi.
But it's real Sephardi.
It's like it's not the Hasidic.
Exactly.
It's not saying Nagdishach or Keser instead of whatever Naritzcha. It's
like proper Moroccan.
So there's a lot of the nusach, the pronunciation, right? How do you call that? Something as Baruch instead of Buruch.
They would say in
the Havara, yes. It's like so those are a lot of things. It's very difficult because I never feel super comfortable in shul to daven loud, to daven with voice.
Because you still, when you read the Siddur naturally, you have Hasidic pronunciation.
Yes. When I make Kiddush, it's completely butchered. It's like half this, half that. Because with my kids who go to schools here, and this is the nusach they the Havara they use, I obviously have been using that. So slowly it's been infiltrating my lexicon or whatever, my way of speaking. That's a huge challenge. I think the if there's any sort of criticism, it's just tuition is expensive, the usual things that people struggle with.
But the sense of community when you go to shul, it's good chevra.
I think it's good chevra. It would be tricky for most Hasidim, especially again. I spent
tell me
a decade plus in this secular world. I went to college. I got I learned English. I took some remedial English, and then I learned the regular English college courses. So it's much easier for me to communicate. But a lot of people coming straight out of the Hasidic community, it would be a stronger.
If you were going to give them a primer,
cognitive dissonance.
A Hasidic family experiencing the modern Orthodox world for the first time, here are just a few pointers to keep in mind. What would come to mind initially?
One of the first things is that it's much more live and let live than in the Haredi world, meaning, I don't think anyone's gossiping in particular about how many times this person goes to shul or whether this person shows up JFK just for Kiddush, right?
Yeah.
So it's definitely, in that sense, it's definitely easier. I don't know. I don't think I've been here long enough to be able to.
What about when your kids come
dole
home?
Out advice.
When your kids come home and you talk to them about what they're learning in school, and
it still surprises me how much Israel plays a role in their education. It's a big
difference. Yeah,
it's huge. It's huge, and I should say the Hasidic and the Haredi community more broadly, they're very pro-Israel.
For sure.
It's a whole misconception in the secular world that they're not. They are very pro-Israel, even if they oppose Zionism or the secular Israeli government or the Israeli draft.
They're rooting for the same people.
Very pro-Israel, more so than almost anyone. But you don't see Israeli flags.
Yeah.
The kids don't come home speaking about Israel, or they don't have fairs in Israel, or they don't come home with fake Israeli passports.
Yeah.
All the, so it was a little bit.
That's de rigueur in the modern Orthodox. They have a day. It's very cute. My daughter came home and she had the fake Israeli passport and a picture of an airplane with her face in the window.
Yes.
I'm very touched by that because I'll be honest, I kind of hope that if my kids if when I'm living across the street from my kids, I would love to this be,
Say that again. Your first preference is to live across the street from your kids, right?
That's my wife's first preference, wherever we are. But I don't want my kids living anywhere other than Israel. I don't
want my kids to make Aliyah. That does concern me, and it just goes back to what I was saying before. I feel like kids, families should live close by. Mm-hmm. It's unnatural what society has done to us. And this is another thing I mentioned in the previous interview, that I appreciate how much the Haredi community has fought back, at least the Hasidic community has fought back against technology, because I do think that corrodes.
Such an important point you're making.
But hold on, but specifically is that it makes things that are far away feel close by, but it's unnatural. It's just not true. Evolutionarily speaking, it doesn't work that way. right? It's not the same as actually having this proximate, relationship with people.
That's the one area of the Hasidic world that I wish modern Orthodoxy
Yeah,
adhere to more closely,
right.
which is taking the dangers of technology more seriously and, postponing as much. And schools are doing a little bit more
Yeah, they're
now.
beginning.
But the Hasidic community, again, it's hard because, they're primed to keep this stuff out, and we're much more porous as a community.
Yeah.
But I wish parents took it more seriously and didn't associate it with being Hasidic, meaning
Right.
banning technology.
Right.
Everybody's still traumatized
Right.
from City Field. We're like,
Yeah.
oh, the rabbis are banning the internet. But there
So
was
true.
something that the very warping of the mind and the
Right.
effect it's had, and I see it in my own home with
I
my
really
own
wish
kids.
my son never came home and told me that a kid he went to for a play date had a PS, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to give in, but at some point it becomes torturous for them and feels unfair. And I can't explain to him that his brain is not going to become mush thanks to the fact that we're not
Yeah.
letting him get a PS, whatever. It's very hard for them to grasp it,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if I were in the mood of more advocacy, maybe I'd become an advocate against, technology here. But,
that would be a wild reversal. One question, and this is really the question that I'm most curious about, and I'm not asking you to speak on her behalf, but like through your lens, the thing that I find most moving about your story is that through all of these changes and very dramatic shifts in your religious identity, in your personal identity, in your professional identity, your marriage remained intact. And I'm wondering, for a lot of people, that's once that support falls, then everything falls apart.
Right.
And I'm curious what you attribute the fact that your marriage, through such very real upheavals and changes, how did it remain intact through all this?
Wow. It's a good question. It's not just intact. I would say it's better than it's ever been. So first of all, I credit my wife with much of everything. Even I was going to tell you earlier, I was throwing in some things about, stay in your marriage, that kind of thing. My wife is literally specializing in that. She did her PhD and dissertation on that topic.
Really?
Yeah.
On like how to make it work.
I don't want to speak on her behalf. I think she should get her own interview. And I'm launching my own podcast, and I interviewed her for that on the first episode. That was like the topic. But
I would love to bring you both back to explore that.
thank
for
you.
real.
And by the way, one of the things that, again, I told you there was like many, many things that contributed to my ultimate sort of change in perspective was your interview you had with Joshua Leifer and his wife. I forgot her name. Very illuminating. So I like the format.
That was last year.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, and it was interesting to see their perspective, and I would love to follow up with them to see where they're up to in life at the moment.
For sure.
I had a sense that maybe they too were going to sort of become more religious again, even just for community purposes, because I felt an affinity. I felt like we're on a bit of a same track, and I felt like even though they were trying to not get there, I felt like they were going to get. Anyway, this is gossiping about another
previous
interview.
guest who we continue to love, and,
Yes.
and I appreciate those words.
But my wife, she was the one sort of planting the seeds, in some ways.
Really?
Yes, of course, because I was more sort of like, okay, I could be more by myself. I could, do my own thing, live, not too close to other human beings. And perhaps growing up, my recollections, my memories from growing up were a little bit less favorable than hers. Mm-hmm. But she's had good families, good community, and she missed it. She happened to have left mostly because the shidduch system was not working for her, and she was going for a degree in psychology, and maybe, it just felt like, what's all this for? I might as well just leave. But she never, She never hated her education growing up. She got a good education. She really had strong, fond feelings. I'll say another thing. My in-laws, her parents were divorced and then each remarried. So she has two families. They've, generally speaking, throughout our entire time together, and this goes even when we were dating as non-observant kids, they were nice to us.
You met when you were both
not observant,
not affiliated, not observant, and you both kind of like came back to Teaneck together on your own terms, and you both love it here,
of course. She so what I was saying is that her family was, we were always welcomed there, we were always accepted, we were always treated as regular kids, so like any of the shunning didn't happen. And my family was a little bit more tricky. Not only was I not religious, I was also the boogeyman of the community.
You were the face of the...
So it was tricky, some of them
You were called, I remember, a Mosar. I mean,
Moster, yes.
And that's, that comes with a lot of baggage to that title. You were like the... You were like the Salman Rushdie of the yeshiva world. No, I remember that period.
Right.
And, as we spoke about before, that takes a toll and it ends up escalating.
Right.
Were you able to have any movement, and how do you even approach healing with your own family?
It's been a journey, throughout this whole process. But, I appreciated I had a brother who would send me these like 3-minute long voice notes every so often, every few months. Basically, Naftuli, we love you, and this, you're hurting the community, and just like going back and forth and sort of like painting this nice portrayal of the community and why are you doing this, whatever. It doesn't really matter what the content of
He would send these to you the whole way through?
Periodically. Sometimes, over months. And I was laughing it off, but I sort of appreciate that actually in hindsight. It's just sort of like it kept that connection. It kept this sort of sense of like, I haven't given up on you, So even if my family wasn't as sort of close to us and as accepting of us as my wife's family was, there was still a sense of like, I feel like my family could have hurt me, could have gone out there and spoken up against me. As far as I know, they never did, certainly not publicly, that is. And, so they sort of managed to the best of their ability. So I kind of appreciated it. And again, now that I'm able to sort of see things in a different light, I respect that. And I feel like they deserve credit for it,
My last question, before we always do rapid fire questions, but I'm sure there are people who are going to continue to advocate for education in Hasidic yeshivas. And it's not going to be you. I don't know if it will be Yafed. I'm sure it is not an issue that will ever fully disappear. Right. And I'm curious, what advice would you give to the next person who is frustrated and says, I want to bring change, and this becomes their cause, and they'll look to you as kind of the founder and the kind of the originator of the movement? What advice would you give them if their sincere concern is having basic education in their yeshivas, in their community? So,
this is not so hypothetical, because I met with my second successor at Yafed, who's the current executive director of Yafed, and I basically told her point blank that I have come to believe that change should come from within, and unless you can spur that, get people truly from within, and by that I mean, again, you have to appreciate their way of life, you have to appreciate their fears, you have to appreciate the politics. That's the only way you can even begin to make a dent, because in hindsight, I understand why they felt like these are people who have completely different values from us. They don't believe in anything we hold dear. Why should we listen to them? In fact, we have to protect against them. So the only way that it could be done is sort of like change needs to come from within. I'm now pretty bought into that idea. But at a minimum, if someone from the outside wants to stimulate that kind of change, wants to sort of trigger that, they have to keep that, forefront, that they have to...
It's come from a place of real love and appreciation.
Exactly. And I'm not so optimistic at the moment that the current people advocating for it can get to that place. But whether it's them or someone else, and I'm not pushing for any drastic change. I'm not pushing for anything, to be clear, but I'm saying, like, if I still believe that any change should happen, I'm talking minimal change just to get by, just to be able to get around in the sort of surrounding secular society. Because other than that, the Haredi community is doing everything right. Just double down on community, double down on growing the community. It's strange to say, but double down on having kids, and sort of preserving your way of life.
I always end my interviews with more rapid fire questions. I'm curious, we were talking before that you're not the biggest reader, but I'm curious, were there any books, either Torah books or non-Torah books, that helped you rediscover kind of your love of community? Were there any kind of like thinkers, people, books that like paved the way to make your reintegration go even smoother?
Oh my! I think maybe my wife's writings and dissertations probably.
Okay.
I remember a long time ago I liked Man's Search for Meaning. Oh, more recently, I read, or rather listened to, the audiobook of Wiesel?
Night, Elie Wiesel?
Night by Elie Wiesel. That was so moving. So, like, I didn't hear a lot of stories about the Holocaust, even though 3 out of my 4 grandparents were Holocaust survivors. But they didn't speak a lot, or maybe they even couldn't speak. But reading that was very illuminating and gave me a whole new appreciation for what we need to protect.
My next question, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to go back to school to get your own PhD, what do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be? What would you study?
I don't know what it's called, but something about evolution and religion.
Oh, okay.
Basically the intersection of, I've said this before, that I find that religion is now more tapped into our basic evolutionary needs and instincts than is secular society, and I would love to study that further.
That is absolutely fascinating. My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Go to sleep at midnight, wake up when my son wakes us up, which is usually at 6:30 in the morning.
Naftuli, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.